The short version is that jazz musicians need work and people like video game music. And then Adam Neely wants to act like this is important work in preserving the jazz tradition. You could just teach people to improvise. That would probably be a better use of keeping the jazz tradition alive. But what do I know?
A couple of weeks ago, I played video game jazz music to a crowd of over 3,000. This was at MagFest, a video game and music conference. What I found there was a vibrant scene of young people hungry for jazz
or video game music, because you just said that's what the
8-Bit Big Band is like a 35-piece symphonic jazz orchestra that's dedicated to reimagining and reinterpreting video game music in the same way that the arrangers of the mid-century were doing with other like great canons of work.
Yes, my virtual guest, Swank Skillionaire, has a degree from Berkeley, the jazz spot, and I have several semesters of jazz improv, including an independent study. I kind of played through the full history of jazz, so we have a pretty good understanding of jazz. So we're not coming at this out of nowhere, but we also understand the real world and how like most people don't care about jazz anymore, and how it had its arc, right? Like classical music. And so once that arc is complete, what can you really do that isn't repeating something? Well, you could make video game music. Jazz musicians did, and that's why a lot of classic video game music, like for years and years, people just would talk about how the Mario theme is actually like it's a pretty good beat, and it's jazz. It's a jazz piece put onto an 8-bit console sound chip. Like that is what makes it novel and different than the previous jazz music. Is the fact that it was on a video game console making those sounds. Oh, there's this terrible jacket. Oh man, what is it? Somewhere in between like Dan Flash's and Jackson Pollock. Look, I'm glad all these people have work. Okay, that is the important positive here. You comparing yourself to Quincy Jones, that's a good place to start as far as the important work. Just like Quincy Jones rearranged the American Songbook for jazz, so will we do when jazz needed it. So will we do with video game music for jazz? Shouldn't you do like the opposite, like a new form that, because this was it was a newer form recontextualizing older music, but jazz isn't new. Jazz is older than the video games. It's basically postmodern jukebox.
We now have the great video game songbook.
Is this in it? Like really, this Sonic song is in the great video game songbook, you would say? They don't play jazz version of One Winged Angel. Of course, granted, that was also already quoting and interpolating a Carl Orff piece. Like it was already pulling from the history of music. They're only doing things that already sound like jazz, or literally already are video game jazz.
Aside from the most mainstream one, which is the main Super Mario Bros. Theme, I'd say one that's more indicative of like the video game music jazz scene is Bob on Battlefield, Super Mario 64.
Yes, the original Mario song is literally like a bebop, slowed down, put on a 8-bit chip. But no. The Bob on Battlefield, that is, I'm going to go to a jazz club and be like, you guys know Bob on Battlefield?
I gave a clinic to a high school big band recently, and they read my arrangement of Bob on Battlefield down, and I was like, just out of curiosity, how many of you knew this song before today? Like, did you know the song before we read it? And like a lot of them raised their hands. And I said, okay, great. And I already knew the answer. How many of you were alive in 1997 when this game came out? Literally me and the teacher raising our hand.
Yeah, because they were in high school, and so mathematically you knew the answer to that question before you asked it. But people do play older video games.
It's the same thing as like we all play All the Things You Are, but nobody knows that it's from a 1930s musical called Very Warm for May. Just play it because it's a standard. It's part of a canon.
Right, and so you can also hear how that musical theater song would be transformed by jazz, but they're taking video game songs that already sound like jazz and just playing them on real instruments instead of the thing that makes them novel, which is video game sounds, is the timbres, which is another thing they're going to talk around and try to explain away as not standout feature of video game music. Yeah, so again, you, sir, are no Charlie Parker. Hendrix could make even Bob Dylan good. Yeah, exactly. It's like, where are you making this music better, more interesting, like these jazz greats did? Again, Quincy Jones. This man compared himself to Quincy Jones.
Tune.
Wow, hear how different it
We're
sounds?
seeing that process unfold right now with Bob on Battlefield and other video game music.
And other video game, really obsessed with Bob on Battlefield. Like, of all the greats, Bob on Battlefield.
People will then become familiar with the music from these arrangements, not from their original video game.
Do you think they will, though? Who's going to hear this and who doesn't know? Even the high schoolers knew the song. They maybe didn't play, or they didn't even say they didn't play the game. They just weren't alive when the game came out. But they know the game because they didn't just, but they probably heard it from playing the game or seeing clips of the game being played. Autumn Leaves, Giant Steps, Bob on Battlefield, all the classics. You went to a video game convention to perform it. Those people came for video game music. They didn't come for jazz and then go, what's this from? What is this classic jazz piece from? Is this Charlie Parker? Is this Miles Davis? No, it's Bob on Battlefield from Nintendo 64. Bob on Battlefield.
Like, I know how to play the tune Still Alive.
This was a triumph.
But I've never played the game that it comes from, Portal. Instead, I'm familiar with the tune because of the arrangement that the 8-Bit Big Band did with Benny Benack and the style of Frank Sinatra.
This was a triumph.
So my only...
Okay, so I know that I played Portal, and I know the song from the end of Portal. And the thing is, again, this is totally postmodern jukebox. It's less interesting than the song from the game, which sounds like it's being sung by a computer because that was the theme, is that the AI, the computer in the game, is trying to kill you. Yeah, this is not interesting. It makes the song less interesting. Yes, this actually at least does change the style. Like, that isn't a jazz sounding piece. But this is YouTube content. It's, hey, we played this in a style that don't make no sense.
And now it's like kids can play Bob on Battlefield and say like, oh, I should go back and play that game, Like,
which kids are doing that, though? You admitted they knew the song or they knew the game. They just weren't alive when it came out. But it wasn't like they had never heard of it. They didn't know where it came from. This has happened to nobody so far.
Hired by Nintendo in 1984, he is responsible for the music to all of the Super Mario games, Zelda games, and many other classics.
But they're really dodging around the existing jazz reference in the music they're trying to transform back into jazz.
So we can say that there are rhythmic and melodic elements of video game music that work well for jazz. But there's some other important things to mention here.
Like how they couldn't be real instruments. Like how they were limited to digital sounds that set them apart from the music that they were based on and borrowing from. And so when you turn them back into regular instruments, it removes novelty.
Music in video games. Right now, he's working on his dissertation on the relationship between jazz and video game music.
When I was examining a lot of these frameworks, I noticed that it was strikingly similar to Tin Pan Alley form, AA, BA, AA ad infinitum, or depending on the player's decisions.
Yeah, that's a relatively good point, which is that the music ends up being shaped by what you do in the game, because you go to a different area, it's going to change, or you arrive at a boss different. So it's very interesting when you hear people like studying video game music for their PhD, because it's like, yes, there are certain ways that video game music becomes unique, but then the flip side of that is, oh, they use like an A section and a B section. It's like, like music, like you do in music. But you didn't mention, again, the fact that they had to make video game sounds. I think meddling up video game music is arguably more relevant, since it is a newer form. It is slightly less dead than jazz. And they're like, yeah, people do that too, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about jazz. They're only doing obvious jazz style stuff converted to big band jazz, because like they're not doing jazz covers of like the Gent soundtrack from Doom or Doom Eternal, because I guess they're afraid of hard jazz. They can't handle the hard jazz like in the Meshuggah area, or like none of it's like Holdsworth. We need big band. We need to employ a lot of jazz musicians. Why? Because they are not otherwise employed. Some of them are employed, but they need more employment. I'm glad you got work. That's even worse. He did Moulin. He did like a Broadway version of Moulin Rouge, which is already a jukebox musical. He won a Tony for a Broadway version, a Broadway adaptation of it. He didn't even do a jukebox musical. It was an adaptation of a movie jukebox musical, which was mostly appealing because Baz Luhrmann is a visually appealing director. Like, that's the thing he's good at. And you're like, oh no, but what I really liked is how he fucking fucked up these classic songs.
Tenenbaum is an MD on Broadway and arranges for Lang Lang.
And none of them
Feige
get
literally
paid
just won a
enough,
Grammy like 2 days
so
ago.
they
The bass
need
player that
work.
normally plays with the 8-bit big band is
You can only hear-
His main gig is touring the world with Sam Smith.
And only
Which is
hear
all to
Bob
say
on
that video
Battlefield. When
game
is
jazz-
Sam Smith going to cover Bob on Battlefield?
You know, we have improvising, we have singing, pop style, you know? So that's the hole I wanted to fill. As it relates to the jazz scene, it's unclear.
I love how they just fade out. As it relates to the jazz scene, does that? Because nobody's coming to these concerts specifically for jazz. They're coming for video game music. Happens to be big band.
And with my experience in the historic and contemporary traditions of real authentic jazz, let's just say that I'm trying to get down to the truth of it. If you know
Real,
what I mean.
authentic jazz. No fake jazz here. Also, I was just about to say, he definitely streams, right? Like, that was clearly a streamer camera setup. And there you go. It's like, yeah, because that's what, yeah, they want you to play anime, play a video game song. No requests, no refunds. Good sax
So in some
player, though.
ways, the
That's cool.
vocabulary-
You know, live.
So arguably a lot of video game music is potentially fake jazz. And so the question is then, by converting it to big band, is it then fake jazz? I think it would be if they knew they were doing that, but I don't think they do, as will be revealed. Everyone on that stage has parents that are extremely disappointed in them. Oh, I thought you were going to say that are extremely rich, because guess who can afford to study jazz, play jazz for a living, is when you got some money.
Jazz institutions like jazz education, jazz promoters, jazz festivals are not super hip to what's going on.
Right, because it's people are coming for the video game music. They're not coming for jazz and getting turned on to old video games. Okay, like, what? This is an insane idea. Like, I'm not saying it'll never happen, but you know, the video games are newer and hotter than the jazz. It's video games as a vehicle for jazz musicians who need work. Like, that is what's happening. And you're like, but what we're really doing is we're keeping jazz alive. Well, maybe this is a good parallel. There are people buying G.I. Joes, but they're the people who played with G.I. Joes as a child in the 70s and 80s, and they're now old enough to afford to pay too much to collect ones they did. They're trying to recapture their childhood. And so similar to, I don't know, jazz musicians trying to get jazz work. They're trying to recapture rent check. Exactly. This is all about musicians need work. This is the best, most positive part of this is, yes, musicians need work. They need to get paid. Good for them. I'm glad you got work. I'm glad you got booked. But stop comparing yourselves to Quincy Jones, Charlie Parker. At least they didn't mention Miles Davis or something like that. Would just be
Means that I won a Grammy, technically, maybe.
that's as
I'll
good
say
as it's gonna
I won a
get, pal.
Grammy.
You just
Hey!
better, yeah. No, you got to lean into that, because you're probably not gonna win one for a YouTube video unless they had a special category. Like, all awards shows, they're losing steam, but it seems like it's crossed some line where it's largely below media attention. Yeah, well, that's the thing, is it's not available. They need to, like, stream it and, like, encourage streamers to react to it.
There's a growing scene in New York City, as I found out.
A growing scene of video game meetups. I want to do the flip side thing. I'm gonna go to the bitter end, sit in with Richie Kanata and be like, "You guys know Bob on Battlefield?" But then I'm gonna go to this video game thing and be like, "You guys know Kid Charlemagne?" There it is, Bob on Battlefield. The giant steps of video game music. You guys know that gent riff from Doom? Show with my 8-string. Bunch of elitists only want to play jazz. This is jazz. This is hard jazz.
Why this is happening now?
Why is this happening? Why is this happening now? No, I don't even. Sorry, a jazz standard based on video game tune that doesn't exist. Oh, that's a good idea, actually. Yeah. You guys don't know this one, man? Oh, yeah. It didn't come out in the States. It was only a Japan release on the Super Famicom. Yeah, I feel like there's a great absence of drugs in that jam session all around. Like, video games are their drug. And they all have a serious problem.
Most of these tunes are 20 or 30 years old.
Right.
And I think there are a couple of reasons why that might be. The first is older...
Because you're there, it's your nostalgia. You're the people who are old enough to play it and afford to be able to play it. And it's the games that you grew up... Again, all these people played Mario 64. Okay, this is one of the biggest missing points of this video, is that the other big change in video game music in the 2000s, real instrument sounds. And instead of being like a MIDI for a chip, they're wave files. So you don't there's nothing to convert into real instruments anymore. And they're greatly glossing over this because, yeah, it's why it's not interesting. There's nothing for you to do other than just play it. So there's less novelty to it. And so when you copy classical music or jazz or whatever, it just sounds kind of the same. Again, unless you want to look at like Doom Eternal, or it's all djenty. That's modern. That is some modern ass music. And arguably, you could convert it to hard jazz because it's sort of Meshuggah-like. That is possibly the most annoying part of this video, is how they're like, what really changed was the complexity of the arrangement. Like, no, what changed was it just sounds normal now.
Only now do we have a generation of people who grew up with video game music at a formative period in their life and also have the technical skill to realize this music within a jazz idiom.
I think it took a generation and a half of video game music existing for it to become, like I'm saying, a codified songbook to be able to then be reinterpreted in the way that we do with jazz music.
For the people who grew up with it to be old enough and to be able to afford to spend the time playing it. Right, yes. So, it takes a certain amount of time for a thing to... But, like, we're still missing, like, what made the key period of video game music novel, and they refuse to admit that it was, like, mostly the timbres, because they want to act like it's new, totally novel music, and that by adapting it to jazz, even though they're adapting stuff that was already based on jazz, they are Quincy Jones. Can't fuck with Quincy. This guy's talking like all of music history has been leading up to this. Well, that's exactly. This whole video is just him just being like, and so now we stand here as part of grand tradition, leading the way, leading the path forward. And so he said, like, they'll be teaching video game music. Like they will be teaching video game music in schools, but only because as a way to drive up attendance in their shitty music programs, the same way that, like, you can study rock guitar at Berkeley and it's a complete waste of time because all the guys that inspired it, Vi and Petrucci and everybody, they went there for jazz. They didn't, and there's no extra rock is you can have a course on how to do like super Waylon bends. Like, okay, maybe you could like do something on like Lukather and how he adapted to all these great hits and stuff. It's not like it's a whole new set of theory. It's mostly timbre. It's like teach you how to dial the gain on your amp or something, maybe.
So yeah, there are historical examples of video game music being played in jazz contexts, but it's only now
because it was already jazz. It was already jazz. They just played it. They just played it on instruments. It was on a video game. Now it's on instruments. That was the translation. There's also been original music using video game sounds. It's a separate thing that he's not addressing here because, again, it destroys his whole thesis. But man, their community is on Twitch. It's like the video game community is what you're talking about. You're talking about gamers. How does Rick Beato feel about video game jazz? There's some good music in video games. That is not the point. That is not the issue. Beato sits down with Waluigi. I really love the way that you took what Luigi does, but you say wah.
Thad Jones has some amazing... You could point to Postmodern Jukebox.
Oh, this is important.
For me, that project seems far too couched in irony and jokey cynicism to have any kind of staying power in musical communities.
Because jazz is serious business. You don't make jokes about jazz. It's got to be real jazz. Can't have no fake jazz. Can't have no joke jazz. Can't have no fake jazz. And so, like, this is exactly the thing you're doing, though, this entire time, is if it's not already jazz, you're doing Postmodern Jukebox. The Sinatra version of the Portal song pure postmodern jukebox, except that you didn't appreciate that it should have been funny. You just the point is you have no sense of humor, and that is also why nobody gives a shit, because it's like that's the only way you'd make this shit relevant. Old big band jazz is hyper relevant. Like, no, you're trying to make it relevant by playing video game music in that style. You're not doing the opposite. You're like, we're preserving and elevating the video game music with our big band jazz for the tradition and the history, and the thing that is the most successful example of it is too ironic for you, because it's not serious enough.
Because of that, I think that in 5-10 years' time, this music will be taught in schools as a part of the long, rich tradition of jazz music that goes back to the early 20th century.
It will not. It will not. If it is taught at all, it will be taught as video game music for purposes of boosting attendance, and the most useful thing they could do is show the references of where the music comes from. Just like if you look at film scores, you're not claiming that John Williams invented the romantic period music. You're going to compare to where it came from, like all the video game music, which is like One Winged Angel directly uses Carmina Burana. It's like you gotta that would be the useful thing, and if anything, they'll teach video game music and maybe the technologies related to it. But like as jazz, no video game jazz. Neely, you got too much theory. It's bad. It's bad for your brain.